My name is Tina Oteng, and I'm going to give a brief overview of pancreatitis. In this overview, we'll be reviewing the relevant anatomy and physiology of the pancreas. We'll define what pancreatitis is. We will list the causes and explain the mechanisms of pancreatic injury. And finally, describe the complications of pancreatitis. Let's review the anatomy of the organ. The pancreas is a solid retroperitoneal organ that's found in the epigastrium. That's the upper part of the abdominal cavity. As you can see in the diagram below, you can see that the reflections of the peritoneum have been dissected away to show the retroperitoneal nature of the organ. In this diagram, we can also see some of the important anatomical relationships of the pancreas. It's important to note that in its retroperitoneal situation, the organ is firmly fixed to the first and second lumbar vertebrae, and we'll see why that piece of information is important down the line. It's a fairly small organ, weighing less than 110 grams in most adults. But nonetheless a very important organ which has several functions, as we'll see. The organ itself has very little support, being covered only by a thin capsule of connective tissue. The capsule sends out several septa which divide the gland into lobules. Let's look more closely at the anatomical relationships of the pancreas. As you can see, the head of the pancreas sits nestled within the C-shaped first part of the small intestine called the duodenum. The main pancreatic duct joins with the common bile duct and opens into the duodenum at the ampulla of Vater. We can also see in this diagram the very close relationship to two major blood vessels, the superior mesenteric artery and vein. When we talk about the pancreas, we're actually talking about two glands in one organ. The exocrine portion of the gland comprises 90% of the organ. The cells of this part are arranged into clusters called acini. It's the acini that secrete the pancreatic juice. This consists of enzymes, zymogens, and bicarbonate, all in a suspension. We'll talk a little bit more about the composition of the pancreatic juice further down the line. The pancreatic juice is poured into a system of ducts, which eventually join into the main pancreatic duct. The endocrine portion of the gland forms the remainder. This consists of scattered islands of cells called the islets of Langerhans, which are responsible for secreting four main hormones important in the regulation of blood glucose levels. You may be familiar with two of these hormones, being insulin and glucagon. Let's look in a bit more detail at the pancreatic juice. A large amount of fluid in the order of 1.5 to 2 liters is secreted every day by the pancreas. This is a huge amount when you consider the size of the gland. It's composed largely of water, various ions, and enzymes. The most important of these ions is the bicarbonate ion. This gives the pancreatic juice its alkaline properties. The alkalinity of pancreatic juice is important for two reasons. The first one being the neutralization of the acidic contents that enter the duodenum from the stomach. If the acidic contents of the stomach were not neutralized, they would undoubtedly cause chemical injury to the lining of the duodenum. The bicarbonate also helps to regulate the pH in this location where the pancreatic enzymes work. And as you'll recall, all enzymes have an optimal pH at which they operate. The enzymes themselves are involved in the digestion of proteins, that's the proteases, the digestion of fats, the lipase and colipase, as well as the digestion of carbohydrates, amylase and enolase. The enzymes within pancreatic juice exist in both their active forms and inactive forms. The inactive enzymes are sometimes called zymogens. Examples of these are trypsinogen, chymotrypsinogen, proelastase, procarboxylase, carboxyl peptidase, and phospholipase A2. Let's consider for a moment why it's important that the enzymes are not activated before reaching their target. As we have outlined, the target of these enzymes are proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. These are the same molecules that make up our own body tissues. Therefore, if the enzymes were active before reaching the site of these dietary materials, they would no doubt cause digestion of our own tissues. To prevent these, the most potent of the enzymes are secreted as inactive forms and are only activated once they reach the duodenum with its intestinal contents. Trypsinogen is key in this process. Trypsinogen is emptied into the duodenum as part of the pancreatic juices. While in the duodenum, enzymes that reside within the lining of the duodenum convert it to its active form, trypsin. Trypsin is then capable of activating the remaining inactive enzymes to their active form. Therefore, chymotrypsinogen, for example, will become chymotrypsin once activated, and proelastase becomes elastase once it's activated. It's worth noting that trypsin can also activate trypsinogen. Let's define acute pancreatitis. Acute pancreatitis is an inflammatory process in which the pancreatic enzymes are activated and they cause autodigestion of the gland. There are two general mechanisms by which acute pancreatitis arises. The first of these is the accumulation of an enzyme-rich fluid. This usually arises from obstruction of the main pancreatic duct. This can be due to gallstones, for example, which cause a mechanical obstruction, or they can be due to toxins like alcohol, which cause contraction of the sphincter that controls the flow of pancreatic juice. The second mechanism involves direct injury to the acinar cells. This can be as a result of inflammation, toxins, including alcohol, trauma, and infectious processes. The main causes of pancreatitis are shown on the next slide. The two causes at the top in bold represent 80% of the causes of acute pancreatitis. It's important to remember that though the list is quite extensive, they all operate through one or both of the mechanisms we've discussed earlier. The next slide provides a visual of the most common causes of pancreatitis. Let's discuss the clinical presentation of acute pancreatitis. The characteristic features of acute pancreatitis are that the patient will complain of severe epigastric pain. Once again, the epigastrium is the upper part of the abdomen. The pain tends to radiate to the back. This pattern of pain can be explained by the close relationship of the pancreas to the upper lumbar vertebrae. Profuse vomiting accompanied by nausea is another clinical feature of acute pancreatitis. Lastly, patients tend to appear very unwell, and indeed they are very unwell. The complications of acute pancreatitis can be divided into local and systemic. The local complications are those that are confined to the gland itself. Phlegmon refers to a localized area of inflammation that contains both fluid and solid matter. If this localized area becomes infected, an abscess can form, and this in turn can be followed by necrosis. So you can consider the first three local complications as a stepwise progression. A pancreatic pseudocyst refers to a sac-like structure filled with pancreatic fluid and is yet another local complication of acute pancreatitis. The pseudocysts can become quite large, containing quite a lot of fluid, and can also be subject to infection. Let's consider the systemic complications, and these refer to the whole body complications. We'll first talk about hypocalcemia. This can be explained if we recall that lipase, which is released from the pancreas, breaks down adipose tissue into free fatty acids. The free fatty acids are able to bind calcium from the blood, forming salts. This is a process called fat saponification. By binding the calcium from the blood, the amount of free calcium in the blood is reduced and hypocalcemia ensues. This is a dangerous complication as calcium is required for muscle and nerve function. The second complication is hemorrhage. We saw earlier the close anatomical relationship of the pancreas to major blood vessels. The blood vessels can easily be eroded by proteolytic enzymes once they leak out of the organ. Let's consider hypotension, which is a low blood pressure. When we discussed the pancreatic pseudocyst, we talked about fluid collecting in an unusual place in the body. This is what's referred to as third spacing. So the formation of pancreatic pseudocysts can contribute to hypotension. There are a few other mechanisms by which patients can develop hypotension, one of them being the accumulation of fluid within the abdominal cavity, and this is referred to as ascites, and secondly, by the systemic shock that arises from such a severe condition. Hyperglycemia can develop as a complication if the islet cells, which regulate blood glucose, become involved in the inflammatory process and are destroyed. To underscore the systemic nature of the complications, pulmonary edema and pleural effusions have both been known to develop in acute pancreatitis. We'll now consider chronic pancreatitis. Chronic pancreatitis is a relapsing disorder that's associated with severe abdominal pain, exocrine and endocrine pancreatic insufficiency, pancreatic calcifications, and eventually fibrosis of the gland. When we talk about pancreatic insufficiency and the exocrine insufficiency in particular, very often it's the deficiency of lipase which is most prominent, and patients present with fat malabsorption because they're unable to digest fat. The endocrine pancreatic insufficiency presents with problems in controlling blood glucose levels. Chronic alcoholism is perhaps the commonest cause of chronic pancreatitis, but there are other causes to consider, including long-term obstruction of the pancreatic duct due to things like tumors, scarring, or stricture, and hereditary forms which follow autoimmune mechanisms. We'll finish off by thinking about how we would summarize all of this information. And a useful scheme to do this is to start with a definition, which tells you very clearly what the condition you're dealing with is, the presentation, which adds another layer to your description, the etiology, which is not only a list of causes, but known mechanisms by which these causes operate, and finally, complications of the condition. I hope you found this to be a useful overview. Thank you.